everyone to please settle down. A very good evening to everyone present here. Welcome to our fourth perspective lecture, The Problem with Representation. I encourage all of you to take notes and interact for an enriching experience. It's a great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Ms. Arnika Ahldag. She is the head of Curation and Exhibition at Museum of Art and Photography at the Museum of Art and Photography, Bengaluru. Let's give her a warm welcome.
Hello, very good afternoon to you all. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for this invitation. As introduced, my name is Arnika, and I work in a private museum in the city of Bangalore. But I've been in India for about 14 years now. I did my PhD from JNU in Delhi. And I was very excited when I was invited to speak about my PhD research, because I often get invited to talk about the museum and not so often to talk about my other work. So this was a really great opportunity for me to look back at my research. But I also want to share with you that some 5 years since I submitted my PhD have passed, and my view on my work at that time has also changed a little bit. I submitted my PhD in, I think, the very beginning of the pandemic, and it was tragic at that time, because my research looks at how labor has been represented in the arts. And at the same time, I was in Delhi, sitting in my apartment, and like most of you will have seen, workers were pouring out onto the streets, trying to make their way home. And as though they are the people who build our cities, at that moment of crisis, they seem to be the least looked after part of our society. And at the same time, this was something that my research was looking at. And I would like to tell you a little bit more about the artists that I have come across in my research, but also looking critically at the kind of institutions that have been built in India, the artist collectives that try to propose a sort of counterposition to those kind of institutions, and what artists are battling with in their life in order to make work. So in my dissertation, I was looking at a group of young artists in Bombay, the Clark House Initiative, that doesn't exist in that form today anymore, but I'll tell you a little bit more about it. Most of these artists come from a working class background. And that was important to me to begin with, to look at artists who have a direct connection to labor and how that plays out in their work. My second chapter was looking at artists who have collaborated together with workers, where there's a very big gap in terms of the socio-economic background of the artist and the privilege with which they often come, and the working communities they sought to collaborate with. So I also tell you a little bit about that. And the rest of my PhD looks into protests, artists siding with workers, and so on. But for today, we just focus on these first two groups a little bit. I have to apologize in advance. I feel like I'm going to drink at least a liter of water whilst talking to you, because I'm not used to this very dry climate anymore. And I hope you bear with me. So, representation, as you see in the title of this talk itself, is fraught with contradictions. While art is often seen as a tool for empathy, it can also preserve power hierarchies within institutions, for example, and perpetuate class divides, especially when art's political potential is kind of hijacked or neutralized for the institution's gain. And I think that's at the core of my research in general, and also something I would like to invite you to think with me through what that means. I'll come to the first group of artists, the Clark House Initiative. So as the term initiative already says in itself, it wasn't an art collective, but it was a group of people who came together in Bombay at a specific point in time, in 2011. I think Clark House Initiative shut down in 2018, 2019. And in the beginning, the idea was to create a space that artists from marginalized backgrounds can come to and find a place to work from, find a place to talk to each other, to share experiences, and to host exhibitions, because at the end of the day, that is what artists want. And the place was started by Sumesh Sharma and Sasha Kola. Sumesh Sharma was a young man, foreign educated. Sasha Kola has a degree from Oxford. And they had access to a space in Colaba. So those of you who have been to Bombay may know that all the commercial art galleries are in Colaba. The Kalagoda Arts Festival is in Colaba. It's a very congested area. It's a very commercial area as well. So you have to imagine that there's this old colonial building right next to Regal, or opposite Regal Cinema, which is quite iconic, and people like to just go there and spend time there. And inside this little building on the ground floor suddenly was this art space. And I believe that this art space came into being out of a need, because a lot of these artists had made experiences with commercial galleries. They had been turned away. They had been told, this is not for you. And they came together to start this as a possibility, really, to experiment. I know Clark House Initiative well, because I was invited many years ago as a resident. So I lived inside Clark House for about 3 weeks, I believe. And I spoke about my practice and I worked on my practice, but at the end of the day, it was a lot about spending time with each other and getting to know each other. And yeah. So sorry. And it's a residential building in a way. It doesn't have white walls, what you know from galleries. Usually it has a kitchen, it has a little room in which residents could stay. And a lot of the artists who came there also used to stay there overnight. They would just roll out some mattresses among the artworks, sleep there, and eat there, cook there, bring their friends, and so on. So it was a quite amazing space, to be honest. And it had a lot of artists coming from Maharashtra, from Bombay, but also from elsewhere. And it started out as a possibility for artists, especially from a Dalit background, to practice. But it eventually fell into the kind of structures that they tried to counter. So, like every space, even Clark House Initiative had to raise funds, and they would do these auctions in which they would sell works. You can see one of the posters from one on the auctions on the slide on the right side. And they didn't get a lot of foreign funding. But they had the support of more senior artists who would just give money to the space so that they could run it. And it was also a place of a lot of ideological exchange, of talk about the political conditions in the country, but also a space of shared experiences, lived experiences. And I would like to talk you a little bit through the practice of some of the artists for you to understand better what kind of work came out of this. The first artist I want to introduce to you is Amol Patil. Amol is an artist who is from Bombay, and his grandfather was already a poet who would perform for workers' unions and workers' movements. And his father used to work with the municipal corporation of Mumbai and be a sweeper. At the same time, also somebody who would write folk songs and perform and sing and so on. So the idea of performing and music and so on was in Amol's family. And for his work, he often looked at the family archive in order to make work. This takes us to a video which I will play for you. So a lot of the performances that his grandfather staged, or the little theatre plays, often had painted backdrops, and they were painted in black and white. So what Amol has done here has taken the idea of the backdrop, but made the backdrop the main actor, while he embodies certain objects that would be in the space. I'm glad that all of you are also coughing and that it's not just me. Yeah, what you can see here is somebody who has looked into his personal archive, into his family archive, and thought about the visibility of labor and labor histories and how to bring them into contemporary art spaces. So the idea of objects turning into a body and being embodied and performed within this video piece is something that deeply interested Amol Patil. It's one of his very early work from 2013. His practice has much changed since. We'll come to this a little bit later. And if you look at the idea of the sweeper, something that he had witnessed within his family, there's another photographer who's not part of the Clarkhouse initiative, but who many of you may know, Sudhara Golve, who's also based in the city of Bombay, who does a lot of workshops for young photographers, documenting street life, documenting manual labor, manual scavenging. And whose work is often shown within the context of NGOs and is often more direct at foregrounding issues, foregrounding conditions of workers, who I think has been a strong mentor to Amol Patil. But at the same time, in his work, the idea of the sweeper, the idea of labor appears very differently. This is a still from another video work that Amol did, in which he performs the act of sweeping. Well, this is an installation piece in which you see a lot of objects that to Amol Patil are related to the idea of sweeping. So what we're looking at is somebody looking at memory, somebody drawing from their own and their family's memory in order to create work. Somebody who's working with the memories of a lived experience that is very close to home in a way. So there's not a lot of distance between the artist and what he's trying to tell audiences. At the same time, I think what is quite critical here is that audiences in India may find it quite easy to connect to this work and to understand the kind of visuals that they see. While if you take this to an international space, the meaning of this perhaps changes or is not as easily grasped. So while we often perceive art making as something that is universal, if you bring in more localized nuances, it becomes a little bit more difficult of what the artwork can convey to audiences. Amol Patel became quite successful. He showed at the last Documenta, for example. Documenta is a huge art exhibition in Germany that is taking place every 4 to 5 years, and had a really beautiful installation there where you had large fields of soil with little machines below that would kind of rotate and make the soil move. So an idea of how you could speak about mining and what impact it has onto the soil. And then little sculptures across the walls that would relate to labor in some ways, but would also relate to labor force and the invisibility of the labor force, that you don't know the people who are actually doing this kind of work, who are often actually the original landowners, and then land has been bought for them for corporations, and usually people don't just receive money, but also employment within the government in this sector to then work on these fields that they once owned, and many of them move to the cities. Which also brings me to the next artist I would like to introduce to you, which is Prabhakar Pachpute, who's now based in Pune, who's also become a quite successful artist. He was also part of the first generation of Clark House artists, and he in fact had the first big solo show that Clark House had. And what he did was that he covered the entire gallery with soot. So he blackened not just the ceiling, but also the windows and everything, something that is unthinkable in museums or other galleries. No curator, no museum director will ever allow you to do something like that, at least not at the moment. And then he had used charcoal to draw landscapes of mining, but also people that inhabit these kind of landscapes into the space. You can see workers here, and often what he does is that he removes extremities or the head of the worker and replaces it with a tool in order to address the idea of how the body is being looked at in this kind of work, that it's very mechanized in a way, that it comes close to the idea of a machine, and that the human at the same time is looked as a tool. The entire space was then, kept dark, and the audiences were given torchlights in order to navigate the space, so you almost had a little bit the sensation of going into a mine and discovering these kind of paintings on the walls. This is another work by him. What I find very interesting about Prabhakar is that when I met him for the first time, he was telling me that he was drawing directly onto walls, because that was a possibility for him in order to be invited to the places where they would show his artworks, so that he could not just send the artworks, but he himself would get to travel. And he traveled quite a bit. He went to South America, he went to Germany, he went to a couple of other countries in order to paint these kind of murals. And his idea was to eventually create a sort of archive of mining experiences from across the world, and being able to bring something like that back to his village in Maharashtra, and one day build a museum there for his people in a way, in order to share these experiences that he had seen elsewhere. A little bit later, when Prabhakar became more successful, he was more and more painting on, or drawing on large panels, drawing on canvases, and making sculptures, because it became the demand of the commercial artwork. And in order to be able to survive with this practice, at some point you can't just keep going to residencies, you also eventually have to make work that you can sell. And of course, murals are hard to sell, And then his artworks became more artworks that could enter the market and so on. He's very successful with that. I think his practice is very amazing because it has also moved away from a event kind of approach of where he speaks about a specific protest march or a specific experience to more broader views of landscapes that have been damaged through mining. And this is an artwork from the last Venice Biennial in which he showed a sculpture that you can see on the side and a large painting that is on the wall. Prabhakar Pachpute was invited by the Art India magazine many years back to give a talk about his work. And the Art India magazine is supported by the Jindal family. And they had brought one of his big sculptures in. So that's also a little bit the conundrum in which these artists often find themselves, that the artworks get invited and the artist gets invited to talk about the struggle of their families, the struggle of where they are coming from, and the art is welcomed, and at the same time people don't seem to see that the same place that has been taking away a lot of this livelihood and created the struggle for people is the same kind of patron who then also supports the arts. He was quite outspoken about this, and there's a large article in the Caravan about this that you could look into if this interests you further. Another artist I would like to introduce to you is Ranjita Kumari. So what I had told you a little bit earlier was that Clark House Initiative found themselves very quickly in a space where a lot of male artists were working at Clark House. It was a group of young men who were working there and very few women. So looking at the practice of the early years, it also became obvious that those kind of voices were soon missing in a way. But Ranjita was somebody who was there quite early on. Ranjita is from Patna, and her family belongs to the community that looks after dead bodies. And at the same time, her father was also involved with the Communist Party. So there was awareness over the politics of caste within the family and exposure early on. And Ranjita Kumari got a fellowship to study at SNU, and while she was at SNU, Shiv Nada University in Delhi, she was looking at the construction site workers. So unlike here in Ahmedabad, where it's very nice that the campus is right in the city center, in Delhi a lot of the big campus are outside the city in areas that are still being developed, and you find these very privileged private universities then surrounded by a lot of construction sites, and Ranjita often felt more connected to the people working on these construction sites than the fellow students she was studying with, because even there was a huge gap in terms of the socioeconomic background that she was from. And then what she did was that she invited the female workers working on these construction sites to give her these headpieces that are that you see in this image, which they place on their head in order to carry heavy objects. And in return, she made new ones for them, but she wanted the old ones. And then out of these kind of pieces, she built this installation that you can see here, which is called Unseen City. To talk about the female labor that goes into building cities. At the same time, she also has made a very big series of watercolors in which she shows a lot of animals that are connected to these construction sites, like donkeys, for example, that seem to be carrying the heaviness of these construction sites in terms of material. And at the same time, she often works together with her mom. So her mom works in the household, and Ranjita, after leaving SNU, leaving Clark House, moved back to Patna and looked a lot at the domestic space. And these two paintings that you can see here are relatively small watercolors, and the one that you can see on the left has real human hair in it, and it's actually quite striking when you see it in person that you have something so repulsive in a way, this ball of hair that is wet and that is then attached to this very delicate and very beautiful watercolor. And on the other side, you see cloth and a lot of small sequins pasted onto that cloth. So this idea of finding beauty within the domestic space is something that interests her a lot. But I think it was important to look at the work of somebody like Ranjita because she was one of the few female artists and brought in that perspective, but at the same time, Klackhouse Initiative in terms of its institutional structures was not able to kind of like give her the kind of support that a female artist may have needed at that time. So she had a child at some point, and there was no support that Klackhouse Initiative could extend to her. So I'll stay here for a bit and I summarize a little bit what I just narrated to you. Klackhouse Initiative's most notable contribution was its redefinition of Dalit art as a movement rather than a mere category. The collective fostered an aesthetic that was deeply personal and poetic, rejecting the overly didactic or documentary approach often seen in art addressing social justice. By rooting their work in lived experiences, their own lived experiences or those of their parents, drawing from familial histories, generational struggles, and community narrative, the artists at Klackhouse Initiative produced works that resonated with tenderness and vulnerability. They brought a fresh, subjective lens to caste, class, and gender struggles, while simultaneously imagining new ways of seeing these worlds. However, Klackhouse Initiative's framework of inclusion, grounded in informal bonds like friendship and kinship, ultimately proved fragile. While it provided a platform for artists from marginalized and working class backgrounds, it remained dependent on the central figure of the founder and curators, who were not from a Dalit background, whose leadership and networks sustained its operations. The reliance on individual agency rather than structural support mechanism left Klackhouse Initiative vulnerable to collapse when those individuals moved on or faced a controversy. I think the problem that was very obvious from the beginning was that while these artists were very talented and very, very interested in learning and understanding and articulating their thoughts, they were often spoken for on behalf. So a lot of, especially in the early years, you could see that Sumesh and Sasha would be invited to international panels to talk about the work of Klackhouse Initiative, while the artists were often creating the work. At the same time, I think there was a little bit of a doubt of if you have a terminology like Dalit art, if it kind of then comes with the expectation that people make art of a certain kind and that they will always speak about struggle, that they will always talk about personal narratives. And in hindsight, it's difficult to say how much of this came from the artists directly or how much was imposed on them in terms of thinking. Klackhouse idealism also collided with practical realities. Although it critiqued existing institutional frameworks, it depended on similar systems, such as international funding and market-oriented programming to survive. This parallel reliance mirrors the contradictions with many alternative spaces, the tension between their radical visions and the need to navigate capitalist structures to remain operational. The Klackhouse Initiative artists themselves, despite their groundbreaking work, found their voices mediated through the curators and were not equipped to independently sustain the collective once the institutional scaffolding fell away. So that's being said, while Clarkhouse Initiative stopped in 2018-19, a few of these artists became internationally really known and have a really, really flourishing practice going at the moment, but there are also those artists who did not manage to do that. Yet its closure underscored a broader issue in the Indian art ecosystem: the lack of sustainable support for alternative spaces. Clarkhouse Initiative's was dependent on precarious funding. A single figurehead and informal networks ultimately left them vulnerable. Its demise serves a stark reminder of the need to develop structures that can endure beyond their founders, ensuring the continued survival of spaces that challenge dominant power structures. Clarkhouse Initiative was a unique and transformative experiment, often offering marginalized artists a platform to reimagine the aesthetic and political landscape of Indian art. It crafted a new visual language of solidarity, tenderness, and subjectivity, giving a voice to those who often were excluded from dominant narratives. However, its inability to sustain itself reveals the limitations of radical collectives operating within an unequal art system. Clarkhouse Initiative's story raises critical questions for future endeavors. How can alternative art spaces balance their radical ideals with the need for long-term sustainability? How can marginalized artists claim agency and independence within systems designed to suppress them? And how can such spaces institutionalize their vision without compromising its core values? Much earlier, there was an art project that I think led me to this kind of research that I was, even from today, I would say that was one of the most successful, and whatever successful means we can discuss perhaps a little bit later. But practices where an artist who came from privilege had an understanding for what other artists may need. And I think Navjot Altaf, who's based in Bombay, and her project in Chhattisgarh and Basta and Kondagaon is a really, really fantastic project. Some of you might know Basta Kondagaon is known for its metal casting. Jaidev Baghel was one of the artists who became known out of Kondagaon, and Jaidev Baghel himself inherited this practice through his family, and he was interested in creating a space as well. So he started Shilpigram, which was a studio space, kind of, where people could practice different art forms from the region, often looked at as crafts, but who brought in this kind of like awareness that artisans and craft people are also artists in their own way. And Navjot Altaf was traveling to Kondagaon and met Jaidev Baghel very early on, formed a friendship with him, and often came there to practice. After many years working in Shilpigram, she had this idea of creating a new space herself. The space was called Dialogue. It still exists. I traveled there earlier this year and met a lot of the people who were still practicing from there. And I think what's interesting about this space is that it never tried to kind of romanticize the craft. It was a space for people to experiment in contemporary art and for people to practice quite freely away from the expectation that the form of craft would perhaps bring to them. What you can see here is the building that Navjot built. I think she got some seed funding from the India Foundation for the Arts, and then subsequently started selling her own work, selling the work of the artists in order to sustain the space. It is used for education as well. A lot of children come in the afternoon, which is something that you can see in the photograph on the right. maybe architects in the making here. And it also has a space for people to sleep, to cook, to stay. But Shantibai and Rajkumar, two of the artists who are still around a lot, they usually come there during the daytime to practice. They look at it a little bit like their workspace and then go back in the evenings to their homes. The wooden sculpture that you can see on the left is Shantibai's sculpture. That is what she works in. Her medium is wood and making these large sculptures. And one of the bigger projects in the 90s that Navjot started there was to really just spend a lot of time with the people there and understanding their needs. And it turned out that one of the needs of a lot of the women in the neighborhood were to have access to safer water pumps. So often the place of where water can be collected from has a lot of just water gathering. So there are lots of mosquitoes and people fall sick quite often. Then often see women are being looked at by men while they fill the water pots and then lift them up. The lifting is difficult often because it's so heavy. And then Navjot spent a lot of time with these women and came up with these really new designs of what these water pumps could look like. And even if you were to travel to Kondagaon today, you would still find a lot of these water pumps around. And you can see a very contemporary, very fresh design. They look really beautiful. They all look a little bit different. And at the same time, it's something that it was so important to the community. So the idea of craft, of everyday objects, but with a specific design, is something that is, exercised here, thought through in this work. But at the same time, it is also the work of a contemporary art piece, because there is a certain degree of invention, of thinking things differently, and so on. And I think what really matters is that this was done in 1997, so it's really about 30 years soon, and that something could live on for so long. I think also the meaning of conversations is really important. It was never Navjot who kind of imposed her own kind of thinking and her own, where she was coming from, onto the people there, but giving them a space to kind of come up with their own work and creating the space in a way that they wanted to. Often, I think this has to do a lot of the ability of redistributing privilege rather than exercising it or just creating distance between people from different backgrounds. So I'm coming to the, almost the end of this presentation already. But Navjot Ahltag's practice exemplifies the nuanced and critical approach to socially engaged art that goes beyond surface-level representation by fostering deep, reciprocal relationships with subaltern communities and challenging systemic inequalities. Her work advocates for art as a transformative, relational, and temporal process. However, it also highlights the ongoing challenges of navigating institutional pressures, market dynamics, and the ethics of representation in collaborative projects. This analysis of Ahltag's work provides critical lens to consider not only for her practice, but also the broader implication of socially engaged art in contemporary art contexts. Through this research, I argue that the intersectionality of caste, class, and gender in Indian art demands a rethinking of collaboration and representational practices to foster equitable and sustainable approaches in art making. And coming back to the title of this talk, the question was, what is the problem with representation? And I think that representation is often tokenistic in a way, that a lot of the institutions say, we must include. And the must include is often dictated by funding. Institutions are more likely to receive funding if they foreground the practices of marginalized communities, marginalized artists, and so on. That then often informs the practice of artists, because as an artist, if you struggle, in order to make a living. And you know that's where the money is, and that's where you will be invited to an institution to make work. It reinforces that you will look at those aspects of your practice. And this is in no way to point fingers at the artists, because I truly believe people are trying to survive in this field as well, but it's actually a problem that comes from the funding into the institutions. And then the next problem is that the burden of representation is often falling onto those people. So if you're Dalit, if you're from a weaker socioeconomic background, then the demand becomes that you have to talk about these experiences. And at the same time, while this may give you visibility and possibilities, it is also on you to then educate people over something that they perhaps should be knowing about, or perhaps have not asked questions enough about. And at the same time, the problem with representation is also that it kind of assumes that there is some sort of unity. Representation can only exist if you assume that something that is very complex and very layered can be represented through a single voice, a single image, and of course that is not really possible. So this terminology of Dalit art has been criticized a lot and has been questioned a lot, because while we can say that a lot of artists from a Dalit background chose to work in political art, they could still approach it through every possible angle, and there is not, it always uses charcoal, for example. Something like that doesn't exist. Yeah, I think this is what I wanted to talk to you about today, and I'm very happy if you have any questions, if you would like to ask me anything more about this work. Yeah, thank you.
And so, the question I have is that in the beginning you said that you did this research for a long time, and you have had some changes in your over time. I'm very curious to know what specific aspect have you had those changes, like just knowing that change would help us have a good insight on how to change with times as well.
I think, see, for me, when I was doing this research, I was doing it from the context of the university that I was studying in, which was JNU. So for me, having these conversations was a lot easier in a way, because I was surrounded by these questions all the time. And I think I always had a very critical approach to institutions. To art institutions, to the art world, to the commercial art world, and so on. So it was easier for me to look at the art world as the problem. And I think that is, sits in all of my research and in my entire PhD. And then towards the end of my time with my PhD, I joined a private museum. And I saw all of this from the other side. I saw it from inside the institution. And we're trying hard to do things differently, but we often fail. And I think this understanding for me, how much has to do with funding, became something that I saw on a daily basis. That no matter where the funding is coming from, that it always comes with certain expectations. And funding is often to make the funder look good, look the funder like somebody who really cares. But they often don't. And, you know, then even when you work within an institution, you are opening these boxes to be ticked by artists. And while you're fully aware it's something that you should not be doing, you still do it because of deliverables and timelines and so on. So that's one thing. Another thing that changed for me was that I saw Clackhouse over a period of, I don't know, almost 8 years. So from being a friend and being invited in and spending time there, I became an external who was looking at it and writing about it. And I stayed in close contact with all the artists, and there were hours and hours of interviews that went into this kind of research. It's also not the kind of research that you usually do in art history, where you observe an artwork and then write about it. It was more the kind of research where you spent a lot of time with the artist and understand where they were coming from. And it was a very strange feeling to put that into a PhD. And then also knowing that it stays there, because that's often the problem with PhDs. You write it and a total of 2 people will read it, and then that's about it. So all the work that goes into it, and then you move on. I think and Clackhouse eventually was also closed because of a controversy, because they lost the space, that is what they say. But at the same time, this was the beginning of Me Too, and Clackhouse Initiative, for the founder was called out for his behavior. And I think to see a space collapse like that was on one side really painful for the artists, but at the same time to see an institution that wants to counter the institutions falling into the same trap, dealing with power hierarchies, making the same kind of mistakes that more formalized structures are doing, was a difficult experience. And I think I personally navigated away from it because I found it really hard to wrap my head around it, what was happening there.
Hi. I just wanted to ask you, were there any conflicts of interest with respect to your position, certification, plus how was your response in relation to the engagement with these artists? How did they see you and your position? So how did you navigate that?
Yeah, so obviously I didn't grow up in this country, so there's always a degree of distance that is involved in this. At the same time, I think my staying there, my living with them for, even if it was just for 3 years, and then staying in touch and eventually building friendships, was allowing me to bridge that gap a little bit. At the same time, it makes me feel like a biased researcher because I didn't keep the objective distance that I perhaps should have maintained in many ways. So it's strange to write about something that you're also emotionally invested in some ways. What I don't know what you're hinting at, but if it's about me not being from this world, that is there. I mean, for me, scholarship is one way to counter it. You know, all that I can do is try to understand, try to listen well, and then put it into words in my best ability. And I think that all of these artists have a really terrific practice, and I want people to know about that. And I think that's what I can offer. That's what I can do, but of course, none of these lived experiences, none of this has anything remotely to do with my life that I lived up until now. So, yeah. Does that answer your question? Not really. Okay.
understand to the people here that after the further representation calls on individuals in national communities, but also while you explain the story of the art house and how the founders would often speak on behalf of the marginalized communities. And there's this disconnect between they don't perceive it to be natural, what the artists have gone through. They can see our rendition of that, where we are thinking that they're understanding. And that's where the disconnect happening. Like, again, Mark says we cannot speak up themselves. How does that get together?
I think we all operate in the field of language, right? And it's often those who get to articulate best and that they get invited to speak. And I think, within the arts, it technically should be different. I think that, seeing somebody's work, it doesn't mean that the same person also has to theorize upon the work and speak on the work. And a lot of artists are not very comfortable in speaking in public forums and so on. However, I think it's connected to what I also said is that, the stereotyping of people who have started working on their lived experiences and then demanding of them to keep working in that field and expressing those kind of experiences often doesn't allow for them to change. Somebody who has formerly spoken about, the work of a sweeper, if they want to change and say, hey, now I want to draw flowers, it would be difficult for them to make this change. And then to place the burden on those kind of people and re-narrating the kind of struggle that they have been through, or their families, the kind of like caste-based violence they may have seen, experienced themselves, is almost a bit like a vicious circle. It keeps reinforcing itself in so many ways. I think the founder speaking on behalf is a little bit different. I think it's a little bit more of a problem of the international art world, that nobody has time. People move very quickly. You have to put together a program, and you don't have time. You Google the 3 most interesting speakers who can come from this country, from that country, and that's how programs are often being put together. I think that's a little bit of a different problem, and also saying that, like I said, a lot of these artists have become successful eventually. With showing at Venice Biennial, Documenta, and so on, they really broke out of it and are able to show their work. So it's a little bit of both, I think.
So in example of natural arts, the creative space where artists will work in explorations and crafts or artists. How does space like that sustain? Because usually women are not running, which is why you don't get certain boxes. If you're not taking the boxes, you're not taking the
That's exactly at the heart of the problem. I think when I went there earlier this year, I could sense that there wasn't much happening anymore. So they managed to kind of like run these workshops for kids, and I could see that kids were coming regularly, but it's not a vibrant art space. It's not where a lot is happening. And I think while Navjot managed by using her network in Bombay to sell some of the artworks, which a lot of the modernists have done, by the way. I don't know, Meera Mukherjee, for example, is an artist who worked a lot with the women who would come to her studio and help her doing her work, teaching them embroidery and then selling it to the richer friends in Kolkata. So a lot of the modernists actually did this kind of thing. But I think with dialogue, it's obvious that it couldn't sustain itself over in the long run, in a way. As it's well maintained, it's there, people can go. I met a young artist from MP who was there painting, And she had gotten to know about this in some way. But of course it's difficult. At the same time, you know, this is an opportunity to kind of like also step out with your practice and think about these kind of spaces as non-capitalist spaces, you know, and to not make art because there is financial value attached to it and because you can sell it in a way. For me, dialogue is more of a space for people to meet and talk to each other. And we were there with a group of 3 researchers. We worked on a different, or four researchers. We worked on a different project, and we just ended up spending half a day at dialogues, talking to Shantibai, talking to Rajkumar about the history and so on of this institution, the situation of crafts in Chhattisgarh at the moment, right now, and many other things. And I think the fact that dialogue still exists and that people still go to have conversations is also a win of sorts. You know, we always think in these categories of like, oh, an exhibition needs to take place. Oh, somebody has to sell work in order to make money. But to have this almost utopian dream of like, you have a space, because that was often you need a space, that's where it starts with. But you utilize it differently. You utilize it for children and for meeting and talking to each other, and maybe do a festival once a year, and that's okay. Nothing much more has to come out of this place, but it's where people feel safe, where people feel like they can meet other people who understand their practice or have an interest in their practice. Maybe that's sometimes good enough to actually keep these places going. So I think dialogue is in a totally rural setting. Dialogue attracted artists who were practicing more as what we consider crafts, while Clackhouse was in the heart of Bombay and attracting very young artists right after art college. So artists who had been in college for a couple of years and therefore were taken care of through the college, then had another place to come to. And I think the conversation in those 2 places would have been very different, because Clackhouse was a more politicized space, and a lot of conversations around caste would take place, while I think dialogue was more of a free-spirited place where I think the idea between like what is craft, what is art was discussed, but it was more interested in really practicing, in running workshops and so on, and giving people access to material, safe spaces to work in, and exchange over these practices. But I think the difference of whether you're in Colaba in the center of the commercial arts, or you're in Basta, in Kondagaon, is huge already. And I think what is also a huge difference is that dialogue was started by an artist. So by somebody whose main focus was on practice, while Clackhouse Initiative was started by a curator whose focus would always be exhibitions and showing to other places. So even at the very beginning, those 2 differences make out massive difference in the end.
I have a question. So, there's a shift happening with galleries or museums representing these marginalized communities. As you said, that these institutions, right, they fund it just they represent these sort of arts just for the fun. So, do you think there's a shift happening in the country right now?
So I said institutions, but I think what I mean is that a lot of the funding, let's say in like from the early 2000s until the pandemic, and the pandemic changed everything, even the funding system, was often coming with an incentive of balancing something out, giving visibility to something. And then the idea was often to bring in artists who would represent those kind of issues in a way. I think this has changed. I think right now a lot of work has been done, a lot of work has been done by artists. There is much greater understanding that no matter from what background you come, you should be free to have your practice seen in the way you want it to be seen. And I think these kind of like the socio-economic background of somebody is not the incentive to be invited anymore, and you can show alongside bigger artists. I think that's still different in the commercial galleries though. I don't see many commercial galleries showing a lot of diversity in their rosters. I think they still go for a different kind of artists with a different practice.
How is like your research and knowing whatever you do affected decisions that you make now as a curator in a private museum?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. So obviously the museum that I work with works a lot with the collection that the museum has access to, and we have a lot of textiles, we have a lot of works of art that would have been made by people who never got credited for their work, who you don't know, who are your craftspeople and so on. And I think that's important, but what we also do often think about is, I'm so sorry, that we look at the team that is working on the artworks or for the exhibitions, that there is a greater diversity in opinion and knowledge over the works that we show. When we do something like, when we talk about miniature paintings, when we bring in patronage and so on, we often invite voices of contemporary artists to also speak about these works in a way, so that it's not a painting exhibition done by art historians only, but also have the ideas and voices of artists coming in, reflecting onto these works. But at the same time, we're very aware to not kind of like do the same tick box kind of system. Oh, now we have this voice here and that voice there, and now we are all settled because this is now all of society that is represented in this exhibition.
I just wanted to know what inspired you to choose this particular topic as a research. Was there something that happened in your case of your that made you choose it?
So it's a very JNU topic, to be honest. But I wrote my MPhil on the history of the collection at the NGMA. And I knew that I wanted to work in the field of institutional critique and how institutions are being built, and that is actually the major focus on my PhD, in my PhD. What you have seen here is a very, very small segment of it, and I think the idea was always to, think about how can we build more robust institutions, how can we build spaces that people feel like they belong to, that they can practice in, that they can see themselves, that bring in audiences who can see themselves in the artworks and so on. So I think that's where I came from. And then I knew a lot of the artists that I really wanted to work with. So while my research on the NGMA was a very lonely kind of research, because I was spending a lot of time in archives and going through documents and government policies and so on, and the only person that I spoke to was the director of the NGMA. I think after that I was a little bit frustrated with this kind of approach, and I just wanted to surround myself with more people and speak to more people and see what informs their practice, and therefore I shifted into that direction. And then a lot of it has to do with your teachers, with your supervisor as well. So my supervisor was Kavita Singh, who's actually an expert, who was an expert on miniature paintings, but who also had always looked into the histories of institutions and the way institutions have been built. And then there are a couple of other professors at JNU who could guide me in terms of like this idea of Dalit aesthetics and whether it exists and what it means and so on, which is Aloni sir who's there. And I think I wanted to make the best of my time within the university, and therefore this topic came into being. Yeah, so I think that's what I meant a little bit right in the beginning, what means success. You know, what does it mean in terms of like, are you successful if you show internationally within the big exhibitions, the big biennials and so on? Or are you successful when you really believe in your practice and you're still doing it? You know, and I have an enormous amount of respect for people who keep practicing despite, you know, and who really believe in their practice. And I think, for example, Ranjita is somebody who really believes in her practice and who keeps practicing. And she shows an exhibition every now and then, but is by far not as successful as, for example, Prabhakar and Amol in that sense, in terms of exposure and being able to show. I don't know what it takes to be successful in the arts. But I think a lot has to do with really making good work, of course, but also being able to put yourself out there, you know, and to be able to meet a lot of people, to network a lot, get people interested in your work. And I think that's super difficult if you're a young mother living in Patna versus a young man living in Bombay, you know, and I can see those kind of differences often impacting how people can show their work in a way, if showing is the marker of success in a way. And I think also, you know, keep working. There are a lot of artists who work relentlessly and work all the time, and often that really, you know, leads to success or leads to something greater. And then there are artists who make one work here and there, or they'd only make works when they get commissioned in order to do something. And I think it's amazing when people stick to their practice and just keep working really hard.
I had a question. Yeah. So you mentioned that the initial idea of Clark House was to give a space to people from Dalit background and people who usually do not get a space to practice their arts. And since it was in a place which is such a prime location, Kolaba, right in the middle of where all the art is, so don't you think that with time the place might have gotten a bit selective with the people who came in, and it must have become contradictory of the initial idea that was to give space to people who are not getting representation?
Yeah, so I fully understand what you mean, you know, and my question was always, what does it mean to be an artist as part of Clark House Initiative? You know, is it a membership system? Do you have to do something in order to get in? And of course, ultimately it's a space of exclusion as well, because I think that it was a circle of friends, and then other friends came to it, and then people who had very interesting practices perhaps managed to enter at some point. But how many artists can be part of this? And then, of course, there is exclusion of sorts. And I think the problem is then also there's no transparency. No, even until today, you wouldn't know why certain people were there. And I think friendship is great and makes amazing work possible. At the same time, it means that somebody who's not a friend cannot be part of it. And I think that eventually also created a huge crisis for Clark House in a way. So yeah, absolute lack of transparency there.
So the key examples that we have been introduced to, those things get this planning. In a way, do we, this is a challenge come across maybe like rather or something like how can sustain if we have such negatives? Is there a way to sustain it? Is there a particular method or ideology? Something that they can follow because we know that money is a huge power, but this current program is the way that we can sustain it.
Yeah, that's a very big question that is very hard to answer. I think that what was amazing about Clark House was that you had a lot of very senior artists who really saw value in the place and who would support with money and so on. At the same time that, again, there's a lack of transparency, like where did this money go, who decided what the money would be spent on. The context I'm working in is very different because at the museum where I work, we work with a lot of grants and we get the money in order to do certain things. So it's as transparent as it can get. We have an annual report, it's available on our website. Everybody can look into how much we've spent on what. And therefore, it's a body of people who decide, and I think that is already a very good beginning, that you have a kind of collective of people who make the decisions and not an individual. How we can support, sustain, like actually us, you and me, I don't know, I think writing about these artists helps. Collecting art can be a thing. A lot of these very young artists really don't sell their work for much money, and sometimes it's really available for less than what we would want to spend on a pair of shoes or something. And I think that's a good opportunity in a way. But I think this thinking about how to build institutions, how to build more robust institutions is something that is work that needs to happen all the time, and institutions constantly fail. Different practices inform institutional building, whether it's feminism, whether it's anything, and at the same time then you look back at just a series of mistakes that were made again, and to stand up again and do it all over again is also something that is quite important. But yeah, I think this question of how to sustain people in the arts is a really big one, and some people have figured it out quite well. What I do find always intriguing about the arts is how much friendship there is and how much people are willing to support each other, how much artists are supporting each other with space, material, money, opportunities, and so on. And I think that's really great because I don't see that as much in other fields, and yeah, something to learn from them.
I had a question. So you worked with the Dalit community. If you ever have the chance to research into other marginalized communities, say like in Northeast, there are many different diversities and tribal communities. How do you think their experiences would differentiate from the Dalit community that you researched?
Very difficult to answer without having done this kind of work. To be very honest with you, I think I would also not do this kind of research anymore. You know, for me, this was an opportunity at a certain moment of time where I did this. I think I wouldn't go back to these kind of methods anymore. But see, I think there's a lot of scope, but at the end of the day, there's a little bit this question of how to talk, how to work across these power hierarchies, you know, and if you have money that comes either from the West or from very wealthy corporations within India, from very wealthy patrons, there will always be a certain interest in, you know, working with marginalized communities of sorts. So it's a tricky one, and I can't possibly say whether their experiences are alike or the same, so I wouldn't have an answer to that.
Thank you, ma'am, for such an enriching talk and for giving us the honor to learn from you. On behalf of the CEPT University, I would like to extend a heartfelt appreciation and gratitude for your time. Could we please have a huge round of applause? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a great evening. Thank you.